Hello everyone, I'm back for another Q&A, and this time, for the first time, I'm doing a Q&A only for my Patreon community, so a Patron-only Q&A. Let me start off by apologizing. I know it's been way too long since I did my post and you got to ask your questions. It's been almost 2 months by now, so I'm very sorry for the long delay. It's been a very busy couple of months. I've been focusing a lot on making videos on the primary, like my primary output on the channel, and also on a bunch of other things. So, but I'm glad to finally be able to sit down and answer some of your questions. The channel is going so well right now. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers already, which is absolutely crazy, and that's in a large part that's thanks to you guys as patrons. I really can't stress enough how much I appreciate your support. I know I am not giving you that much exclusive material because, after all, my main focus is on the primary videos on the channel, and your support is of course primarily helping me make those videos. It really does make so much of a difference. Like I've been able to buy many of the books that I've used for research for the last couple of videos. Would never have been possible without your patron support, for example. So I want you guys to know that it really does make a difference, and I'm so thankful. So thank you all so much. Now let's get into the questions. There were a couple of really difficult ones this time. I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, let's start off with Mikhail Stankovic, who says, an open question, relation between imagination and the religions you have studied. That depends on what you mean by imagination, I guess. My mind immediately, because my mind works like that, and my mind immediately goes to people like Ibn Arabi and the philosophical tradition, like the Islamic tradition, where they talk about this thing called, that's usually translated as imagination, or khayal in Arabic. So Ibn Arabi talks about the imagination as a very important aspect of the spiritual life, as being a kind of barzakh in Arabic, an isthmus in between the material and the spiritual world. He has a great comparison he makes where you look at the difference between a shadow and then the part that's not a shadow, so like the sunny side and the shadow side. And the isthmus, or the barzakh, or the imagination in this case, is the line that separates the black from, or the dark, the shadow from the sun. And the sun then being perhaps the spiritual world, the shadow being the material world. And so it's this line in between the two, whereas at the same time, there is no line in a real sense, because the line itself kind of is in both parts, if you know what I mean. And it's in the imagination, according to Ibn Arabi. I think also Suhrawardi talks about the imagination. It is here that a lot of spiritual experiences take place. So a lot of the visions that Ibn Arabi would have, he would say that this is the imagination. When we have dreams, this is the world of imagination that we experience. And in the world of imagination, we can get messages from the higher world of the spiritual realm. So that's one thing I come up with when I hear the word imagination. And that, for that school, that becomes incredibly important. Like I said, that is the part of us that has religious experiences. That's the place we go to after death, according to Ibn Arabi. So in the Quran, it talks about after death, there's this intermediary period where one is in the barzakh, the sort of intermediate stage before the final day of judgment, when you are finally sent to damnation or to paradise. And so the barzakh is this place, the place of imagination is where we spend our time in this sort of between period. But if you mean imagination in a more sort of regular sense, just the way we talk about imagination today, I think there's a lot to be said there. My mind immediately goes to a specific field within the study of religion, which is known as cognitive. What's it called? I think it's a cognitive study of religions. It's a subfield within the study of religions that basically looks at the way our brains and the way we are through evolution, we are sort of programmed to see agency in the objective world outside of us, because that's the way we are able to, well, relate to others and feel empathy in these things. But that also leads to an experience where, I think we've all had like a vacuum cleaner. Maybe not that specific case, but many people may have a vacuum cleaner and they give it a name, like here's Bob the vacuum cleaner. So you give agency to this object. Or there's like a thunderstorm or like a lightning strikes, and we sort of want to ascribe agency to natural phenomena in that way. That is a natural extension of our social programming in a way, and that is very strongly connected, according to this theory, that is very strongly connected to why we believe in things like gods or spirits. It is a sort of result of this social programming that we have to ascribe agency to others and to feel empathy and to be able to relate to how other people may be thinking. So we're able to look into the perspective of another person. And then that leads us to be able to sort of look into the perspective of some imagined agency in the natural world, for example. And that's also led to very interesting theories that, for example, people with autism, on the autism spectrum, and autism generally, what people with autism have problems with is being able to relate in the same way to how other people may be feeling, or they have trouble with this particular aspect. And so that has led people to say that, well, maybe people who have autism are less likely to be religious. But actually, one of my friends did her PhD last year, and her research actually shows that this is not the case. And I'll probably do a video on that at some point. That's some of the things that comes to mind when I think about imagination. Maybe, I don't know if that relates to imagination in a direct way, but that's what came to mind for me. I'd say some of these questions that I got some of them don't seem like they're actually questions, but actually video suggestions, because I asked for video suggestions in the same post. So if I'm not answering one of your questions, it's probably because I'm considering actually making a video on the topic, either because it's a very complex topic or because it seems like you're actually asking for a video topic. So just FYI. The next one, Robert J. Eilers asked, hello, I'm curious about how frequently the propagation of religions has occurred across human history, and whether there is a relationship to the propagation of languages or national identities. Do major religions exist as an artifact of political dominance, or do they enable it? Best wishes. They can definitely, I think political aspects definitely affect religion. They can definitely enable religions. I am not of the opinion that religions are, you'll see YouTube comments saying things like religion is only a political tool to control people. It can certainly become that, but I wouldn't say that that is the primary function of religion, or that has been the primary way that religion has functioned historically. I'm somewhat of a Durkheimian sort of academic in the way that I relate very much to a sociological explanation. I don't think we can use one explanation for religion, but if there's one that I tend to lean on or lean towards, it would be Durkheim and his sort of sociological, and of course the school that has developed after him. For those of you who don't know, Durkheim was a German scholar from the 19th and early 20th century that developed a sociological approach to religion, where he argued that religion or belief, religion primarily is a social phenomenon that results from a way for people to create an in-group and then symbols that represent that in-group. To explain very, very briefly, but that religion is something that is very much social. It is a way of belonging to something. And so in that way, it functions in a very similar way to national identities, like you mentioned in your question. My colleague Andrew Henry made a series about religion in the United States, which is very interesting and tackles this question where national identity and belonging can often function in a very similar sociological way to how religions function. That we create these symbols like maybe God, or in the case of a religion, or these different religious symbols. In the case of a nation, it might be a flag, like the United States flag, for example, and that flag becomes a source of almost worship, or at least reverence, in a similar way to how gods or other aspects of religions may function in those religious traditions. So I think, to me, religion is something that just is part of how we function as human beings, and especially as human beings in a wider group. That religions have always existed in that way because there is this human need for that kind of belonging and symbols to represent that belonging. But I think that also leads to the question, what is a religion? Like, would American patriotism be a religion? Like, I wouldn't say so, even if the phenomenon is very strongly related. So the propagation of religions in history has occurred, I think, very frequently. It happens all the time. You can start asking questions about what defines a religion, what counts as a religion, when do religions appear historically for the first time? That's questions that are impossible to answer. But as far back in history as we can possibly see, religion is there, even at least in a broad definition of religion. It's there, it's propagated, it gets connected often to ethnic or national, national identity is a very modern phenomenon, but that various kinds of identity formations very strongly related to religious identity as well. And that is my opinion in that sociological kind of way, that religion is primarily a question of identity and social belonging. That's my personal stance on that stuff. Amir Huda asked, how has studying religions changed you as a person and how you view the world? I think it's changed me quite a bit because religion is such a huge part of human culture and human civilization that learning about history, we learn a lot, learning about religion, we learn so much about things like history, we learn so much about how humans function in social environments. I think I've gained a huge appreciation for religion. That's one of the things I've tried to do with this channel. I think many of you have probably noticed it, is to counteract this idea, this sort of post-enlightenment idea that religion or theology prior to the Enlightenment, any kind of philosophy or science prior to the Enlightenment, is this ignorant, unenlightened, backwards thing, and then the Enlightenment happens, which changes everything, and now we know we've figured it out, basically. And I think that's a very dangerous and ahistorical way to look at history, because we look at many of these thinkers and philosophers and religions and traditions from history that have so much to offer intellectually and maybe spiritually as well. There's this long, very complex traditions, and then some atheist comes around, like, not saying that atheism is a bad thing. There are very good arguments for atheism, but I think a lot of the conversation between atheists and theists, I guess, is really on such a low level because of that, because the atheist is often so uninformed about the complexity of religious belief and theology, asking questions like, well, how would God create? If God is good, how could he allow evil to exist, or pain or suffering to exist in the world? Like, these are questions that people have been dealing with for thousands of years. Like, you didn't just come up with it now when you sort of destroy the whole enterprise of theology by coming up with that question. Like, people have been trying to answer that question, sometimes answering that question for a long time. But we're sort of taught that before the Enlightenment, everyone was stupid, and now, like, science has saved us. It's a really kind of a religious way, it's a religious rhetoric in a way. It's the way that the Enlightenment kind of turned everything around. Now we're enlightened. It's similar to how Jesus comes and he changes the world and our relationship to God, or Muhammad, like Islam comes around. Before Muhammad, it was the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance, and now we've been saved. You know, it's this common theme across religions that there's this turning point in history. And the Enlightenment really functions in a very similar way for us as modern people. I think the Enlightenment has a lot to offer. I think the Enlightenment did a lot of good things, but we also need to recognize that a lot of the results, or what resulted from that, is a skewed version of history that is not very helpful. I really went off on a tangent here. I think to answer your question, I think I've become a more understanding, tolerant person because of my studying different religions. I think I've gained a better understanding of how different people think about certain things, how many differences there can be between people, but also how much we are so very similar in a lot of ways, but we maybe express it in different ways. We have different languages in various ways. Both literally, we express things with different words, but also symbolically, we often, I think, as human beings, we express very similar things or the same thing, but we use it, or we do it using different languages, symbolic or verbal languages. I think that's sort of realizing that and gaining a better understanding and knowledge of the world's different cultures and religions has really helped me become a better person, a more understanding person, a more tolerant person. And it's helped me be able to have conversations about these difficult topics that are often very, very much needed, but can also, I think that's one of the things that can change the world into something better. We are able to have conversations that are on a much higher level, and I think studying something like religion allows one to have those kinds of conversations. So in a lot of ways, I think studying religion has really changed me or affected me in a big way. Amir also says, I would like to see a video about Hermes. Stay tuned, because that's it's coming pretty soon, actually. I'm working on some stuff about Hermeticism and Hermes with Dr. Justin Sledge. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Abdurrahman Al-Hamali asks, I have three questions, and I feel free to choose whether to include them in Q&A or in a video. Okay. Your opinion on Tom Holland's documentary on Islam, or his documentary Islam, The Untold Story. What do you think of the thesis? Unfortunately, I haven't seen that documentary. I think Tom Holland is an interesting scholar. He has some good things to say. I think we need critical voices in terms of the history of, or the early history of Islam. What I mean by that is that we need people who question the traditional narrative, not necessarily because the traditional narrative is wrong, but because it can really help us. If we sort of cleanse the palate and then begin anew, we can come to some new, very interesting conclusions. I don't necessarily agree with everything that Tom Holland has to say. I think he's sometimes he can come off kind of polemical. I haven't seen this particular documentary, so I can't really comment on it though. Another question he asks is, what courses did you take in university? Are there specific courses you would recommend for someone just interested in learning but not in specializing? I mean, any kind of introductory course about religion, I think, is good. I mean, I did my master's, so that's like 5 years. There's a lot of courses in that, and really every university has different courses, different schools, different countries have a different curriculum, and then each university has a different kinds of courses. I think some of those courses that really helps you understand religion, like you can go courses studying Islam, like I did courses on Islamic philosophy and many courses on Sufism, for example. I did a course on, I did a full course on Shiism, I believe. But I think, like I said, for a starter, or for starting off, I think it's wise to get that sort of broad perspective. If that's what you're interested in, if you're interested in studying religions academically, there are courses that talk about, for example, theoretically, about how religions function and the different theories about what religion is. it's hard. It really depends on what you're interested in, because where I study, the courses are pretty specific. So you have like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and then it's politics and religion is like one course. Very interesting, of course. You have theories about religion is one. You have a course on philosophy and phenomenology and hermeneutics, and so many different courses that are often kind of specialized and particular. But I think if you can find a course in like introduction to the academic study of religions, that would, I think, help a lot in getting a broader and more nuanced perspective on religion, because that's really what the starting point needs to be. So you need to have this wider picture and this wider perspective of religion, and then you can sort of go in and study the different things, because then you'll have the tools to understand how it all, well, not all of it, of course, but how some of it relates to each other and the historical context and all this. To have the critical academic, sort of scholarly attitude and perspective to religion, I think is the most helpful thing. I unfortunately I can't recommend any specific courses because I can't think of any right now, and I don't know of any particular courses in that way. If you like can send me an email or a private message, and I can sort of look more closely at different courses from the universities where I studied. Maybe I can find something similar to what you're interested in. So feel free to send me a private message later on. Danny van Heck asked, do you think it's possible to have genuine spiritual experiences with psychedelics like DMT, or is it just brain chemistry giving intense hallucination? This is such an interesting topic. I think psychedelic drugs in particular, of course, there are, to me at least, there are too many similarities between experiences, the claimed experiences of people who have taken psychedelic substances and have these intense psychedelic experiences, and the experiences of like religious experiences or a mystical experience. You read these accounts historically from mystics, for example, or people who have had various religious illuminations or whatever you want to call it, and then you compare that to something that someone who took LSD or DMT. The similarities are so striking. I think the similarities are too strong for there not to be some kind of connection, in my opinion, between psychedelic experiences that people are having today, for example, and a mystical or religious experience. I think there is some research being done on this, and I definitely think that that's something that's very interesting to look further into. But whether that is like a genuine spiritual experience, like if they are very similar or even the same, which I don't know obviously, but I haven't experienced the psychedelic trip in that way. If they are the same thing, then that's very significant, of course. And in that way, I guess you can have a genuine spiritual experience. That doesn't necessarily mean that I condone taking psychedelic drugs. I generally don't. Of course, there are nuances to that opinion and that discussion, definitely. But generally, I think that I think it was someone who said, was it Ramdas? It was some individual in that movement who said something like, to have like a spiritual experiences on a substance like say DMT or LSD, it's like cheating, because you have the experience without having done the actual work to get there, whereas someone who is a mystic or whatever it may be, he's like meditated for 20 years, he has really worked on purifying his soul and just doing these intense practices for so many years, and then finally he reaches this experience and he has earned it, so to say. That also makes him able to interpret what's going on and handle it and implement that experience much better, whereas someone, some 17-year-old who just took LSD and he thinks he's one with the universe and then he's back to normal, like how is he gonna what's going to do with that information, because he hasn't taken the full route. I think there is something, I mean, I don't have any personal experience obviously, but I think there is something to that kind of claim. I think many people can have transformative experiences. I have acquaintances who claims to have had transformative experiences, and there are studies that show that psychedelics can be used to help dying cancer patients better cope with death, for example. It has certain medical values, and there is more research being done on that. I think this is a very relevant conversation. I don't feel informed enough to make any kind of broad or bold claims about it, but there seems to be a lot of similarities between a mystical experience and a psychedelic experience. You say, like, if it's just a hallucination, like, does it matter? I think anything we experience is the result of chemicals in the brain that are projecting this experience that we're having right now. Even me talking to you now, even me experiencing this table, is a result of a kind of hallucination, I guess. And so to have a hallucination like that, like in a psychedelic experience, how much different is that? This is, of course, hopefully at least, based on like a world outside of me that's giving my senses information, whereas that is all happening in the brain. But I don't necessarily think that makes it less real. I think that depends on how we define real in that case. There's a great line from the last Harry Potter movie, actually. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I don't want to spoil anything, but Dumbledore says, so this is getting out of hand. Harry Potter asks Dumbledore, "Is this all in my head?" And then Dumbledore says, "Of course it's all in your head, but why should that make it any less real?" And this is a fantasy novel, of course, but there's something very profound about that statement. Like, why is something less real? Because it's happening in our head, because our subjective experience, at least according to some, is really the most, like, that is what reality is to us. To summarize, I think yes, you can have experiences on psychedelics that are similar or perhaps very strongly related to experiences that are spiritual experiences or mystical experiences. But I think there's also a difference in both the way that it has been earned by the person having the mystical experience from years of practice, and also in the way that can be implemented into your life. And I think that psychedelics and substances like that generally also come with a lot of dangers. You never know how your brain or your body is going to react. It can be a very, like, make no mistake, even though you can argue that these things have medical value and that they're harmless, like, they can be dangerous also. And so I think I'm not condoning the use of any psychedelics necessarily. I think one should be careful, but I also think that much more research should be done on how these can be implemented, both in a very practical medical sense, but maybe also for more sort of profound spiritual aspects too. Another one, Conrad asks, do you think the future will involve a spiritual integration with religion becoming more syncretic or perennial in substance and more popular? As religious institutions become less popular and less doctrinaire, there seems to be a renewed support in the idea that all major religions are human attempts to understand God, the absolute, the divine, etc., as well as a resurgence of monism and panentheism or pantheism. Do you think this will involve a departure away from positions such as atheism? That's a very complex question. I don't know. I don't know. I think some of what you're saying seems to me to be somewhat true, that people, as I talked about in my video about why people believe, people tend to identify much less with religions, like with the big R, religious institutions. This thing, believing without belonging. the term that was coined by Grace Davy, a scholar. And I think, if anything, if the last few decades has shown us anything, it's that even though people don't identify with these big religions, people will keep doing things that seem oddly similar to religions. They will keep believing in things. They will still keep having various practices. They will, all these things. Generally, if there's a move towards like a perennial thing, I've also experienced that seemed to be a more and more popular idea, that all religions have this inner core that is true, or that all religions are different ways of expressing the same truth. Even sometimes I have those tendencies. I don't know how popular it will actually become, if that's going to become like the majority. I don't think so. I think people generally are too programmed to sort of divide into in-group and out-group, and to claim exclusive right to certain truths, for example. I don't think that's going away. So, for example, whereas, of course, the last few decades have shown that people move away from traditional religions, like traditional religions in this at the same time has also kind of, there's been a resurgence. Just like half a century ago, people were arguing, like scholars were arguing, that religion, like big religions like Islam, Christianity, that kind of religion, capital R, will go away soon. Like in 100 years, that will be on the way out. Now we've seen that that's absolutely not the case. It's been quite the opposite. Like religions have become more powerful sometimes. They have had a bigger role to play in society. So I don't know. I really don't know how to answer this question, other than like we'll see, because these things can be so unpredictable. People are unpredictable, sometimes at least. And when it comes to this, there are studies being done on this. But for me, I don't know. Maybe. Tibet Dagestani, sorry if I mispronounced that, says, greetings. I don't know if this has been asked before, but could you tell us about the countries that you have traveled to? Yes, I haven't traveled too much in my life, unfortunately, and this pandemic has not made things much better. I have been to a couple of countries. I've been to London, so that's the United Kingdom, twice actually. Just for like holidays, but I've also been to St. Petersburg in Russia. That was actually for an academic outing with the institution that I was studying at before. We visited various churches and mosques and a Sufi Qadriya group. Actually, it was very, very interesting. I have also been to Croatia, to Italy. I was in Rome and in Venice, both of which was just lovely. Rome, particularly, was just there's so much history in that city that that's like just a constant walking around looking at ruins and historical monuments. It's really an incredible city when it comes to sort of historical sightseeing. It has the Colosseum, the Forum, the catacombs. It's an incredible place. I have been to Turkey, to Istanbul, which was also related to sort of academic stuff. We were there. We studied Arabic there actually for a week, like a crash course in Arabic, and just generally kind of also went to different different places related to religion. So I went to some Sufi khanaqas, like Sufi lodges. So the for example, the Halwati Jarahi order in Istanbul, I went there. I also went to the Mevlevi Museum. There's so much history in Istanbul as well. So I've been there. I've also been to Senegal and the Gambia, which is in West Africa. They're two countries sort of within each other. The Gambia is sort of inside of Senegal, and they're very strong related in like culture and religion and all this. I was there when I did my master's thesis, and I actually wrote about West African Sufism, the Tijaniya and the Muridiya. My master's thesis was on the Tijaniya, and my earlier my bachelor's thesis was on the Muridia, which are two Sufi brotherhoods or Sufi orders that are particularly strong in that region. I was there. I did field research. I was in a small village in southern Senegal for about a week with this Sufi order, which was just a transformative and incredible experience. That is such an interesting and wonderful country, both of them. I've been to the airport in Morocco, in Casablanca, but not much than that, not more than that, which I regret. I really want to visit Morocco someday. Like, I want to go everywhere. Like, doesn't everyone? Like, I want to travel to every single place in the world, because there's always something interesting. And I really look forward to this pandemic ending so we can start traveling again. And also now that this channel has actually become a thing, I would love to go around and actually do videos in the places that I talk about. Don't know when that's going to happen currently, of course, but that's something I very much look forward to. I think that's all the countries I've been to. Hashem Ismail asks, when you were basically doing your due diligence and studying more about the notion of Quranism, did you find any concrete criticism, refutations, or any major negatives associated with this movement? I don't know about negatives necessarily. I mean, that seems like a subjective thing, but criticisms definitely. I mean, most traditional Muslims are critical of the Quranists. By traditional Muslims, I mean the Muslims who follow the traditional principles of Islamic law, which includes the Sunnah and thus the Hadith, which in Quranism tends to be, if not neglected, then at least viewed at least a little critically, right? The criticism is usually that the Sunnah is this integral part of Islam. It's part of, especially in Sunni Islam, it's almost a part of revelation. So you have the Quran, and then you have the Prophet's example that you are to follow. And to the traditional Muslims, right, the Sunnah is found in the Hadith. This was not necessarily the case in the earliest centuries, where you had a more, I don't know what to use, but you had a more flexible kind of approach to what the Sunnah was, it was a more broad approach where there were, communities formed around certain jurists or in certain locations that claimed to be following the Sunnah through the companions of the Prophet. And of course, Hadith were always, but from very early point was gathered and told. Of course they were. Who wouldn't be telling stories about what you consider to be the Prophet of God. But the Hadith didn't become directly sort of, what's the word? It didn't become so directly synonymous with the Sunnah until later on with people like Al-Shafi, for example, and then that became the standard for how Islamic law was conceptualized. We talk about the Quran as the primary source, and then there's the Sunnah, and from Shafi'i and the 9th century onwards, the Sunnah is equal to the Hadith, whereas earlier the Sunnah could be the Hadith, but it could also be, communical, the practices of the community. It could be the opinions of certain jurists, and so on. Could also actually be considered Sunnah in a much broader sense. Why am I talking about this? But that's the general criticism, that Sunnah is such an interesting or such an important aspect of Islam. It's even mentioned. I think it's mentioned in the Quran, or at least tells the people to, in the Prophet, you have a good example to follow, and that gives them the justification to say that, well, the Sunnah is a commandment in the Quran, and then the important part is that they then traditionally will equate the Sunnah with the Hadith literature, and so then when the Quranists tend to be critical of the Hadith or to even sometimes reject it outright, to traditional Muslims, that becomes a point of huge sort of criticism and spite sometimes even. The comment section on my video about the Chronist, there's a lot of that, people from both sides who argue over these kinds of questions. Yahya Bashandi asks, put this in Discord, but thought I'd repeat it here just in case. This is more history, but I've always wondered if Muslims ever visited or traveled to Scandinavia or Britain, Northern Europe in general, or in the medieval age. This is a topic I would love to actually cover in a future video where I can go more properly into the different historical aspects of this, because this is a very interesting topic. I haven't done too much research into this myself. My old supervisor actually wrote a book where he talks about this kinds of thing, in Sweden in particular, like it's called Islam in Sweden, the first 1300 years. So he talks about the whole history and all kinds of contacts between the Muslim world and Sweden, which I think includes Muslims traveling to Northern Europe. Just off the top of my head, we have, of course, Ibn Fadlan, who has this very famous account of the Rus, which isn't in Sweden, but it is probably in Russia. He describes the practices of a kind of almost a Viking kind of society, which has become one of the main sources for how we understand the Vikings and the Norse people prior to Christianity, or sort of pre-Christian practices, basically. And there's much more, so I'd love to cover that in a video in the future. So on our Discord chat, Wrigglelith, I don't know your name on the regular Patreon page, but he asks, or she, I have an incredibly overly broad question. That's fine. Does Sufism have any roots in syncretism with other faiths, or is it an entirely Islamic phenomenon? That's the $1 million question when it comes to Sufism, right? Many people have different opinions about this, that some will say, even Sufis themselves, mostly sort of modern neo-Sufis, will say that Sufism predates Islam, that it's this eternal tradition that has existed way before, and then Islam comes around and just sort of appropriates it. But in a way, that argument doesn't really make all that sense, because the same can be said about Islam. That's the claim that Islam makes, that Islam is the original religion that's always been around, and then Muhammad just comes around or Muhammad reveals the Quran, which is the final aspect of that sort of eternal religion. Most scholars, and me included, see it as absolutely an Islamic phenomenon. It appears in an Islamic context. And that's an interesting topic, because Sufism, which in Arabic is tasawwuf, which means the sort of something like the path to becoming a Sufi, that was a word that was used primarily originally for a particular group in Baghdad, which included people like Junaid and Kharaz and Muhasibi, for example. And these people call themselves Sufis, and other people, and this thing became known as tasawwuf. But there were other mystics at this time. There were mystics in Persia. They were sometimes known as Hakim, the wise. There were others known as Malamatiya. And it's only a few centuries later that the word Sufism comes to be applied to all of this. So it's sort of an anachronistic term, but it serves its function, right? Because it's all connected. It's all kind of mystical aspects, and they all also influence each other. When it comes to sort of outside influences, of course, there were outside influences also. Islam comes from the Arabian Peninsula. It spreads into this vast area and creates this empire that stretches from India to Spain. It's just an incredibly large region, and of course, it takes inspiration, or it takes influence, and there are syncretisms happening here. When we talk about Sufism, the early Sufis, broadly speaking, we usually we think that they were probably inspired or influenced by the Christian monastics, like the Christian ascetics that lived in the Middle East at the time, based just on the practice and sort of this natural communication that would have taken place at this time. And later on, in more philosophical ways, we of course see influences from Neoplatonism. We look at someone like Ibn Arabi. There are clear Neoplatonic influences there. Now, one person may say that, well, they've just both found the same truth. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I know that that's not true, but Ibn Arabi also, for example, uses very clear Neoplatonic ideas, like he refers to the first intellect, the universal soul, like he knows the language, and that language has inspired him, perhaps through the falsafa philosophers, but nonetheless. So in one way, Sufism did, of course, take influences from other places, even though they always ground everything in the Quran and the Hadith. When I say they took influence, that can often be interpreted to say that, well, this is a foreign idea that comes in, but it might as well just be that no, this other idea really explains this Quranic statement or this Quranic concept very well, and so they sometimes, instead of influence, you may use the word adopt, for example. They adopted Neoplatonism as a language. So I think it's a double-edged sword, because I think we should recognize that Sufism was influenced by other local traditions like Christian monasticism and later on Neoplatonism, maybe Hermeticism to some degree, maybe certain aspects of Zoroastrianism, although I've seen that argument be way sort of overemphasized in a lot of conversations. But I think we need to recognize that, yes, of course it was, but Sufism is also very much an Islamic phenomenon. All the mystics are, if you read any of the Sufis, right, it's all just the Quran, it's all the Hadith. You read Ibn Arabi, like his whole Futuhat or his Fusus, it's all basically a commentary on the Quran and the Hadith. Like there's quotes from those texts everywhere. They always try to ground that stuff in the Islamic tradition. It appears in a completely Islamic context, but the Islamic context has always been a sort of multicultural. Like the Islamic world has always been a multicultural place that has had, Christians and Jews and all these different religions and philosophical traditions that have influenced and given or has served as inspiration for various thinkers and movements. Sufis themselves will often claim that Sufism goes back to the Prophet. I'm not going to sit here and deny that, but I think from a historical perspective, it seems that the early Sufis also took inspiration from these other sources. And they claim that Sufism predates Islam is a bit sort of less, like, of course, it depends on how you say, like, a lot of aspects of what we call Sufism, of course, existed before Islam, as understood as, the religion that the Prophet Muhammad specifically brought with the Quran and that historical event. Prior to that, a lot of the aspects of what we recognize as Sufism existed. So if you want to make the argument then that Sufism existed before Islam, based on that notion, I guess there's some merit to that claim. But the same can be said about Islam. Many of the aspects of Islam existed prior to Islam. And as I said in the beginning of this discussion, that is also a claim that Islam recognizes and makes a point of. Like, yeah, aspects of this religion existed prior to the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, because the same message was sent to other prophets previously. So that's the same argument can be applied to Sufism. Aspects of that existed before Islam, perhaps for the same reason. But the important point to make here is that Sufism, Tasawwuf, when we say Sufism, we mean specifically this movement that appears primarily in the 8th century in an Islamic context, that takes Islam as its starting point. It takes the Quran and the Hadith as its starting point, and it sort of builds on that with influences from other places, of course. But nonetheless, when we say Sufism, at least when I say Sufism and most scholars say Sufism, that is something that is very much strongly connected and part of the wider Islamic religious tradition. I hope that at least answered the question to some degree. I hope that didn't become too complex. It is a complex question, but I think the answer in the end is quite simple. So I think that was all the questions. If I missed any of you, I'm sorry. Please let me know, and I'll try to get to your questions in the future or in the next video. Thank you all for listening. If you made it this far, I'm impressed. I'm amazed that anyone would be interested in listening to what I have to say for so long. I hope I answered your questions in a satisfactory way. Yeah, I look forward to keep working on this channel. As I said in the beginning, we're almost at 100,000 subscribers, which is absolutely incredible. I have some great videos coming up, and I have some collaborations. I'll be doing more collaborations with Justin Sledge over at Esoterica. I think our collaborations in the past have been really fun, and you guys seem to enjoy them as well, so we're gonna keep doing that. I'm doing one thing on Spinoza with Seekers of Unity, who I did an interview with a few weeks ago. So I'm doing a video on Spinoza and Spinoza's God. Speaking of monism and all that, it's going to be very interesting. I also have a collaboration coming with Angela Puka from the channel called Angela Symposium. That's going to deal a bit more with a sort of occult aspect. So I'm not exactly sure. I'll probably be talking about Sufism and some of the topics that I've just been talking about, and also sort of dive a bit into the occult sciences within the Islamic world, and then she will pick up on that as well. And then, of course, I have my regular solo videos coming. Now, actually, I'll be doing a poll actually on my Patreon page, where I get to choose between a couple, 2 or maybe 3 videos, because I have a couple of scripts ready that I want to shoot. I don't know which one I'll be doing first, so I'll let you choose which one I should do first. So one option is a video on Jainism, so a basic introductory video, like what is Jainism. I have a script ready to go for that. And another video will be on the Assassin's Creed. I'm not sure all of you are aware of the very famous video game series, which is like one of the biggest video game series in the world. But that first game is based on a very particular historical context of Nizari Ismaili Shiites in Syria, and their sort of political and military tactics that involved assassinations, right? So I'll be doing a video sort of talking about the real historical context of that video game, and that script I also have ready to go. So I'll do a poll for you guys. You can choose which one you want to see first, and I'll do that on my Patreon page, so you can go there and check that out. So again, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for supporting me. It really is helping with research. It is helping me. Like, without you guys as patrons, I wouldn't be able to do this to the same degree, or really at all at this point. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I am so humbled that you want to support this work, and you are really one of the primary reasons that I even keep doing this. But I think it's so much fun to be doing these videos and to have this communication with you guys. And again, I'm sorry that this particular Q&A took so long. I'll try to be better in the future. And yeah, that's it. Thank you all so much for listening again, and I'll see you in a future video. Bye bye.